Section 22 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6, by Charles F. Horne. Elisha Kent Kane, by General A. W. Greeley, 1820 to 1857. Elisha Kent Kane, son of Judge John K. Kane, was born in Philadelphia, February 3rd, 1820. In his youth he displayed those qualifications of ceaseless activity, daring adventure, and strong personal courage which characterized his mature manhood. Inclined to all efforts involving physical hardships and contact with nature, his early education was devoted to civil engineering, and such natural sciences as chemistry, geography, geology, and mineralogy. Unfortunately, in his 16th year, chronic and functional heart disease developed, which intermittently affected him through life and deterred him from the profession of an engineer. Applying himself to medicine, he graduated therein in 1842 at the University of Pennsylvania, in the meantime having served as a resident physician of the Pennsylvania Hospital. His inaugural medical thesis, based on personal experiments and observations, gave him a reputation which augured professional prominence. In 1843 he was appointed physician to the United States Embassy to China, under Caleb Cushing, who was charged with the negotiation of a treaty with that country. At the wayports and during the tedious intervals of the treaty negotiations, Kane lost no opportunity of travel and adventure. With Baron Leur he visited the Philippine Islands and the volcano of Tael. Not content with the usual point of view, and despite the protestations of the native guides, he was lowered 200 feet in the crater, whence he scrambled downward to the smoking sulphur lake, and dipped his specimen bottles into the steaming waters. In his ascent the loose heated ashes charred his boots, and gave way under his feet. The sulphur vapours nearly asphyxiated him. He fell repeatedly, and was barely able to tie the bamboo rope around him. Drawn up in an exhausted condition, and carried to a neighbouring hermitage, he barely escaped violence at the hands of the offended natives, who considered his rash feat a sacrilege. Resigning his appointment with the legation, Kane established himself as a physician at Whampoa on the Canton River, where illness shortly broke up his professional practice. Fortunately for his future fame, he was unsuccessful in his application to the Spanish government for permission to practice medicine at Manila, and Kane returned to the United States by the way of Singapore, India, Egypt, and Europe, his journey marked by adventure and danger. In these, as in all other sea voyages, he suffered excessively from seasickness, which required all of his indomitable will to endure with equanimity. In 1846 he was commissioned assistant surgeon in the United States Navy. His first sea duty took him to the west coast of Africa, where coast fever invalidated him within 10 months. His desire for active service was so great that before his health was re-established, he obtained orders from the Secretary of the Navy to proceed to headquarters of the Army, then in the city of Mexico, for for duty in connection with the collection of data relative to field hospitals and surgical statistics. Here his activity and daring resulted in his being wounded in a guerrilla skirmish. Assigned temporarily to a surveying vessel, circumstances soon determined Kane's career and gave full scope to his enthusiastic energies and ensured his future fame. The appeals of Lady Franklin, the recommendations of President Taylor, and the generosity of Henry Grinnell had culminated in the organization of a search expedition for Franklin in the Arctic regions. It was provided that the vessels should be manned by volunteers from the Navy, and among those offering their services for this mission of humanity, none was more importunate than Kane. Persistent efforts brought him orders for this fateful voyage while bathing in the tepid waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and 10 days later he sailed from New York for the icy wastes of the North as surgeon of De Haven's flagship, the Advance. This search, known in Arctic history as the First Grinnell Expedition, was made under a joint resolution of the Congress of the United States, dated May 2nd, 1850, to accept and attach to the Navy 2 vessels offered by Henry Grinnell, Esquire, to be sent to the Arctic seas in search of Sir John Franklin and his companions. 2 very small sailing brigs constituted the fleet. The flagship Advance, commanded by De Haven, an officer of Antarctic experience under Wilkes, and the Rescue under Master Griffin. The entire party numbered 33 officers and men. Their objective point was Lancaster Sound and its westward extension, Barrow Strait, whence either or both Wellington Channel and Cape Walker were to be visited. The squadron passed safely through Davis Strait, and, skirting the dreaded land ice of Melville Bay, reached Cape York after 3 weeks of constant and dangerous struggle with the heavy ice, which nearly destroyed the Rescue, borne almost on their beam ends by the enormous pressure from a moving ice pack. De Haven fell in with the English squadrons on the same errand, August 19th, 1850, and, entering Lancaster Sound with his British consorts, devoted his energies to the search in hand. Griffin, of the Rescue, shared with Captain O'Mahony, R.N., the honours of the discovery at Beechey Island of the wintering place of Franklin's squadron in 1845–46. Later, 3 graves of members of Franklin's party were found, and numerous evidences of the good condition and activity of the expedition during that winter. About 3 weeks later, on September 10th, 1850, De Haven concluded that the position attained was not sufficiently advantageous to justify his wintering, and so decided to return to the United States. Unfortunately, strong gales and very cold weather prevented immediate action, and in a few days both brigs were frozen immovably in an enormous ice pack, where they were destined to drift helplessly to and fro at the mercy of the winds and currents for many months. Beset in Wellington Channel to the north of Beechey Island, the American squadron first found itself drifting slowly, but with alarming steadiness, to the north into waters and along coasts that had, as far as they then knew, never been visited. The drift carried the Advance to latitude 75 degrees 25 minutes north, longitude 91 degrees 31 minutes west, and on September 22nd, they discovered new land, to which De Haven gave the merited name of Grinnell. It proved to be an integral part of North Devon, of which it was the northwestern extension. Every few days there was a partial breaking up of the pack and consequent danger of destruction. On one occasion, says Kane, we are lifted bodily 18 inches out of water. The hummocks are reared up round the ship, so as to rise a couple of feet above our bulwarks, 5 feet above our deck. They are very often 10 and 12 feet high, and threaten to overwhelm us. Add to this darkness, snow, cold, and the absolute destitution of surrounding shores. The temperature fell below zero, and the ship seemed destined to winter in Wellington Channel, but fortunately a strong northwestern gale, in conjunction with heavy tides, disintegrated the main pack and set ships, ice and all, southward into Barrow Strait. Here they fell under the action of a southeasterly current, and, drifting all winter, passed slowly through Lancaster Sound into Baffin Bay, where the opening polar summer found them yet fast in the ice, from which the 2 brigs were freed off Cape Walsingham, June 5th, 1851, after drifting in 8½ months, a distance of 1,050 miles. It is impossible to adequately describe their physical discomforts and dangers, the mental depression of the sunless midwinter of 8 weeks, and the even harder experiences of the Arctic spring-tide, when excessive cold and increasing lassitude made steady inroads on their impaired constitutions. Kane tells us they were continually harassed by uncertainties as to their ultimate fate. Yesterday, the unbroken floe, stretching as far as the eye could reach, seemed so firm and stable as to ensure months of quiet, uninterrupted life. Today, the groaning, uneasy pack, yielding to an unseen power, split and cracked in all directions, throwing up huge masses of solid ice that threatened to destroy instantly the ship, and occasionally opened in wide cracks through which rushed the open sea. Indeed, the conditions were so critical and the ice movement so rapid that the entire party, within the brief space of 24 hours, had 4 times made ready to abandon their vessels. In March the cold became intense, and for a week it averaged 53 degrees below the freezing point. Scurvy assailed all but 5 of the crew, and De Haven was so ill that all his duties devolved on Griffin, who heroically bore up under disease and the mental and moral responsibilities that the situation forced on him. In all his efforts, Griffin had no more effective coadjutor than the fleet surgeon Kane. Whether acting as a medical officer, treating skilfully the diseased crew, as a hunter, supplementing their scanty stock of antiscorbutic food with the fresh meat of the seal, or as a man, devising means of amusement and stimulating them to mental and physical exertions, Kane incessantly displayed such qualities of cheerfulness, activity, and ingenuity as tended to dispel the pall of despair that sometimes enveloped the whole expedition. When release from the ice permitted the voyage to be renewed, De Haven decided to refit the Greenland ports, and again return to Lancaster Sound, Fortunately, as the squadron was not fitted for a second year's work, the ice in Melville Bay was such as to prevent immediate passage, and so they turned southward, reaching the United States on September 30th, 1851. Such desperate experiences as those involved in the midwinter drift of the Advance would have deterred most men for a time from a second voyage, but with Kane the stimulus to future work apparently increased with every league that he sailed southward. The ship was hardly in port before he initiated a plan for another expedition in the spring of 1852. This failing, he wrote Lady Franklin in May, offering to go with Captain Penny or any good sailing master to give his services without pay, and pledging himself to go to work and raise funds. Finding it impossible to go with any British expedition, he turned his entire efforts to organizing another from America. His chivalric enthusiasm enlisted the sympathies and active support of Henry Grinnell and George Peabody, the first loaning the ship and the latter contributing $10,000 for general expenses. The United States again aided, not only putting Kane on sea pay, but also attached 10 men of the Navy under government pay. Instruments, provisions, etc. were likewise supplied by the Secretary of the Navy, and aid in other directions was afforded by the Smithsonian Institution, the Naval Observatory, and other scientific associations. At this juncture, the discoveries of Captain Inglefield, R.N., in Smith Sound, afforded to Kane a new route for his activities. The scheme, as far as the search for Franklin was concerned, was well-meaning, but nonetheless fallacious and illogical. Kane was personally cognizant of the fact that Franklin had gone into Lancaster Sound and had witnessed in 1845-46 at Beechy Island, plainly following the direct and positive orders of the Admiralty, that he should push southward from Cape Walker to the neighbourhood of Bering Strait. Moreover, the last mail ever received from the Franklin expedition contained a letter from Captain Fitzjames, in which he stated that Franklin had shown him the orders, expressed his disbelief in an open sea to the north, and had given a pleasant account of his expectations of being able to get through the ice on the north coast of America. A search for Franklin by the way of Smith Sound, 17 degrees of longitude and 4 degrees of latitude to the north and east of his last known position, was to assume not only that Franklin had disobeyed the strict letter of his instructions, but had also abandoned his voyage after having accomplished 1/3 of the distance from Greenland to Bering Strait. As the initiator and inspirer of the expedition, Kane was the natural head of it, but there were difficulties in the way. The assignment of a surgeon to the command of a naval expedition was unprecedented, but somehow Kane succeeded in overcoming even the time-honored observances of the Navy, and was placed in command by a formal order of the Secretary of the Navy in November 1852. Kane repeatedly set forth his belief in an open polar sea, and announced his expectation of reaching it. The expedition was not alone a proposed search for Franklin, but especially contemplated the continuation to the northward of the discoveries made in 1851 by Captain Inglefield on the west coast of Greenland. Kane declared his intention of reaching its most northern attainable point, and thence pressing on toward the pole as far as boats or sleds could carry us, examine the coastlines for vestiges of the lost party, and, seeking the open sea, launch our little boats and embark upon its waters. On May 30th, 1853, the expedition left New York in the sailing brig Advance, there being 17 members all told. The vessel was staunch, well fitted and suitable, the scientific instruments satisfactory, but the provisions were illy chosen for Arctic service, and the equipment in many respects inadequate or deficient. The Greenland port supplied skin clothing, dogs, and Eskimo drivers, the latter being destined to play an important part in establishing harmonious relations with the Etah natives. On reaching Melville Bay, Kane decided to take the Middle Passage, direct through the dreaded pack, a most venturesome route for a sailing vessel. Favoured by an offshore gale, the Advance escaped with the loss of a whaleboat and emerged into the open sea near Cape York, known as the North Water. Stopped by the ice, Kane wisely decided to cache his metallic lifeboat, filled with boat stores, on Littleton Island, so as to secure his retreat since, as he says, "My mind was made up from the first that we are to force our way to the north as far as the elements will let us." The ice opening with the tide, Kane rounded Cape Hatherton and was now in Kane Sea. But the Advance was immediately driven into a cove for shelter. At the first opportunity, sail was again made, and a short distance gained to the east-northeast, when a violent gale nearly wrecked her. Repeated efforts to work the vessel to the eastward along a lee coast destroyed fittings and boat, and were so fruitful in danger that on August 26th, 7 out of his 8 officers addressed Kane in writing to the effect that a further progress to the north was impossible, and they were in favour of returning southward to winter. Unfortunately, Kane was not able conscientiously to take the same view, as such retreat would have left him in a less favourable situation to pursue his explorations. 2 weeks longer the brig was warped to the east during the high water, whenever she was not jammed by huge floes against the rugged coast. But at low water the brig grounded, and was daily in danger of total destruction. Finally, on September 9th, she was put in winter quarters in 78 degrees 37 minutes north, 71 degrees 14 minutes west, in Rensselaer Harbour, which, says Kane, we were fated never to leave together. A long resting place to her, for the same ice is round her still. Winter now advanced with startling rapidity and excessive severity. Freezing temperatures now permanently obtained, the waterfowl were gone, and the scanty vegetation blighted. All were busy, some constructing a building for magnetic and meteorological observations, others making journeys along the eastern coast. Kane visited the high land adjoining Mary Minturn River, some 50 miles away, whence he could see Washington Land in the vicinity of Cape Constitution. Hayes and Wilson journeyed on the inland ice, while McGarry with 6 others made 3 caches on the coast, the farthest being under the face of the largest of all Arctic glaciers, now known by the name of Humboldt. The winter proved to be unusually cold, the temperature from December to March inclusive averaging 54 degrees below the freezing point of water. Most fortunately the men remained in health, but Kane grieved over the loss of his dogs, only a dozen surviving out of the original 80. In this contingency, Kane decided to put his men in the field, and after 2 weeks of excessive cold, the temperature averaging 77 degrees below freezing, a party was sent out while the mercury was yet frozen. Their orders were to reach Washington Land, about 100 miles distant across the sea ice. It soon became evident to Brooks, the commander of the party, that the journey was impossible of execution, and after 8 marches, in which less than 40 miles were traversed, he turned back on March 29th, 1854. The cold that day was intense, about 90 degrees below freezing, and the next morning 4 men were frozen so badly that they could not walk. Only 4 men were left for work. The distance to the brig was 30 miles, while the intervening ice was so rough that they could not drag their disabled comrades. Hickey volunteered to remain, while Zontag, Olsen, and Peterson should go to the brig for help. The 3 men finally reached the Advance, but they were so physically exhausted and in such mental condition that they could not even indicate in what direction they had left their comrades. Kane appreciated the gravity of the situation and the necessity of prompt measures. A relief party was at once started, which Kane led himself, despite his impaired health, physical weakness, and the general unfitness for such a desperate journey. As always, he spared not himself when danger threatened. Olsen, being the clearest-headed of the sledgemen, was put in a sleeping bag and dragged on a sledge as a guide. 18 hours' travel were without tangible result. Kane fainted twice on the snow. His stoutest men were seized with trembling fits, and as yet no signs of the missing party. Fortunately, Kane had taken the Eskimo Hans Hendrik, whose keen eye discovered the track that led to the tent of the frozen men. They were alive, but crippled beyond the possibility of marching. The weather remained fine, or all would have perished, and as it was, Hayes, the surgeon, in his report of their condition on reaching the brig, said, "I was startled by their ghastly appearance. When I hailed them, they met me only with a vacant, wild stare. They were, to a man, delirious." Of the 8 men, only 1 returned sound. 2 shortly died, 2 others suffered amputations, and 3 escaped with temporary disabilities. 3 weeks later, on April 26th, Kane set out on what, to use his own words, was to be the crowning expedition of the campaign to attain the ultima thule of the Greenland shore. Impressed with the impracticability of the direct journey across the main ice pack, he decided to follow the shoreline, 5 men dragging a sledge, while Kane and Godfrey travelled by dog team. He had been led by his resolute spirit to overestimate the physical strength of his men and himself, and the party broke down before it had even approached the Humboldt Glacier. Their enthusiastic leader was stricken with fainting spells and rigidity of limbs, but Kane would not admit his illness to be more than temporary, and bidding the men strap him on the sledge, proceeded onward. His diminished physical powers now became evident through the freezing of his rigid and swollen limbs. Delirious and fainting at the end of the march, he was carried in an almost insensible condition to his tent, when his men wisely took the matter in their own hands and started back for the brig. 9 days later, through forced marches and heroic efforts of his sledge-mates, themselves partially disabled, Kane was carried on board the Advance, fluctuating between life and death. Hardly conscious, his mind clouded, and his swollen features barely recognizable, his general condition was such that the surgeon regarded his ultimate recovery as nearly hopeless. While Kane's recuperative powers were simply marvelous, yet he did not recover sufficiently to make another journey that spring. In this extremity he turned to his surgeon, Israel I. Hayes, who volunteered to explore the unknown shores of Grinnell Land, which lay in sight to the west of Smith Sound. With the seaman Godfrey as a companion and a dog team as the means of transportation, Hayes struggled through the almost impassable floes and bergs of the main strait, and finally attained Cape Hayes on the western coast, in about 79 degrees and 45 minutes north latitude. The return journey to the Advance was possible only by abandoning everything that in the slightest degree impeded the progress of the exhausted men and famishing dogs. This success caused Kane to make one more effort to reach the hitherto inaccessible Washington Land, and for this purpose he placed all his means at the disposal of one of his seamen, William Morton. A supporting party accompanied Morton to Humboldt Glacier, whence he proceeded with Eskimo Hans Hendrik and a dog team on the advance journey. Their track lay over the sea ice about 5 miles from and parallel with the face of the glacier. 5 days took them to the new land to the north, and 3 days later, June 24th, 1854, Morton reached alone an impassable headland, Cape Constitution. From the highest attainable elevation, Morton found his view completely cut off to the northeast, but between the west and north he could see the southeastern half of Kennedy's Channel, as far north as Mount Ross, 80 degrees 58 minutes north. He says, not a speck of ice was to be seen as far as I could observe. The sea was open, the swell came from the northward, and the surf broke in on the rocks below in regular breakers. Morton described accurately the general landscape, but he was an incompetent astronomical observer, and his estimates of distances were excessive. The farthest point was charted nearly 100 miles north of its true position, while Cape Constitution was placed 31 miles too far north by Morton and 52 geographic miles by Kane, who corrected Morton's observations by a series of erroneous bearings. Morton's general account of his explorations has been confirmed by Hans Hendrik in his memoir written some years since in Eskimo. In the meantime, the Etah Eskimo natives of Prudhoe Land had discovered the brig, and through the interpreter Hans Hendrik promptly established friendly relations with Kane. It may be said that the expedition owed its final safety to these natives. Their supplies of fresh meat checked scurvy, and later their dog teams rendered retreat possible. Slight misunderstandings, not always the fault of the natives, naturally occurred. But the Eskimo were honest, humane, and willing, and never committed a hostile act. The summer of 1854 justified the expressed fears of Kane's officers, for it passed in the ice yet unbroken in Rensselaer harbour. It was evident in July that the brig would never be freed from the ice. And in this critical situation, Kane, taking 5 men in a whaleboat, attempted to reach Beechy Island, several hundred miles to the southwest, whence he expected to obtain succor from the English searching squadron. The unfavourable condition of the ice in Smith's Sound caused the failure of this attempt, and yet worse, encouraged the idea of dividing the party, an idea that culminated in the well-known Arctic boat journey, as Dr. Hayes termed it. Despite Kane's futile experiences in July, the majority of the party maintained that a boat journey to Upernavik was both practicable and advisable. Confronted by this attitude of the expeditionary force, Kane assembled them, set forth the dangers of such an attempt, and vehemently urged them to abandon the project, which the lateness of the season and the unfavourable ice conditions rendered most improbable of success. Finally, he granted the privilege of unfettered action to such as believed the journey practicable, stipulating only that those leaving the vessel should renounce, in writing, all claims upon the expedition, and should elect a leader. 9 elected to go, 8 to remain. Kane displayed a magnanimous spirit, equipping them most liberally, and assuring them, in writing, that the brig should be ever open should disaster overtake them. The boat journey was a failure, and Kane bade them welcome when, early in December, he learned that the party, some 200 miles distant, and in imminent danger of perishing by starvation, was desirous of returning to the Advance. Kane promptly sent supplies to the suffering men, and on December 12th the entire crew was once again upon the brig. The winter of 1854-5 passed wretchedly. The physical condition of the party steadily deteriorated. Failing fuel necessitated the burning of the upper woodwork of the brig. Their food was reduced to ordinary marine stores, and game failed equally to the hunters of the Advance, and the persistent efforts of the Etah natives on the ice-clad land and in the frozen sea. In addition, scurvy attacked the crew. Hayes lost a portion of his frozen foot, and hardly a man of the crew remained fit for duty. The necessity of abandoning the brig and retreating by boat to Upernavik, Danish Greenland, was now forced upon Kane's mind. The cooperation of the natives greatly facilitated, if it did not alone render possible, the transportation of their provisions, boats, and stores to Cape Alexander. Kane says the Eskimo brought daily supplies of birds, assisted in carrying boat stores, and invariably exhibited the kindest feelings and strictest honesty. Bidding farewell to the natives at Cape Alexander on June 15th, 1855, Cape York was passed. The land ice of Melville Bay followed, and the northern coast of Danish Greenland reached in 47 days. In the meantime, a relief squadron, under command of Lieutenant Hartstein, United States Navy, had visited Smith Sound, where the natives informed him of Kane's journey southward. taken on board the returning flagship at Disco, Kane and his men reached New York, October 11th, 1855. Kane had hardly reached home when it became evident that his undermined constitution could not longer withstand the inroads of a disease which for 20 years had afflicted him. Change of climate was tried without avail, and he died at Havana, Cuba, February 16th, 1857, at the early age of 37. Between his first and second voyages, Kane had become deeply interested in Margaretta Fox, one of the well-known spiritualists who later published their correspondence under the title of The Love Life of Dr. Kane. Their relations, it is believed, resulted in a secret marriage shortly before Kane's death. The rare literary skill shown in the account of Kane's expedition has charmed millions of readers with its graphic account of the labours, hardships, and privations of Kane and his men. It should not, however, be considered that this expedition merits attention alone from its tales of suffering and bravery, for none other of that generation contributed so materially to a correct knowledge of the Arctic regions. In ethnology, it gave the first full account of the Etah Eskimo, the northernmost inhabitants of the world. In natural history, its data as to the flora and fauna of the isolated and ice-surrounded extremity of western Greenland were original, and have to this day but scantily supplemented. In physical sciences, the magnetic, tidal, and climatic observations remained for 20 years the most important series pertaining to the Arctic regions. Kane's voyage not only extended geographically Inglefield's discoveries 100 miles to the northward, but it also opened up a practical and safe route for Arctic exploration, which has been more fruitful of successful results than any other. Kane was a man of generous impulses, enthusiastic ideals, and a kindly heart. His chivalric nature, indomitable will, and great courage have impelled him to hazardous enterprises, but he stands out in this modern age as an unselfish character, willing to brave hardships and risk his own life on a vague possibility of rescuing Franklin and his companions. End of section 22.